This is Grace Notes. I'm Alan Button, and our guest today is Dr. Ted Beemer. Ted is an orthopedic surgeon who hails originally from Greenville, South Carolina, spent much of his practice years in North Carolina, in the Sanford area, and more recently has spent a lot of time in various parts of the world, ranging from the Dominican Republic to Honduras to Ethiopia and China and lots of places in between. But Ted, you can fill us in on some of that as we go along. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's have you start, if we could, Ted, by your filling in on some of the stuff that I skipped over very quickly just then. How did your travels get started?
My wife and I talked about doing mission work for years and found one excuse or another not to do it until one point in Sanford, we had worked with children at our own church, St. Luke Methodist, and had gone on some mission trips. And then she went on a mission trip with a group from Grace Christian Church to the Dominican Republic, and I thought it was more important to stay home and work that year, and boy, did I regret that. I resolved that next year I was going myself, and we did for a couple of years, and then got involved through that with Cure International, who is an organization in Pennsylvania, but they had a hospital in Santo Domingo. And at the time we contacted them, they were looking for someone to fill in as the surgeon and medical director of their hospital for a few months the next year, which would have been 2010. And long story short, we wound up there the whole year, 2010, filling in that hospital, and then staying with Cure, and after that going to Honduras, and then filling a spot for them in Beijing, China for 3 months, and then in Ethiopia as well. And after that, they decided along the way to close the hospital in Honduras, and we wound up affiliating with Samaritan's Purse and working in Ethiopia at a Korean general hospital in Addis Ababa, the capital, for the year 2014.
A Korean hospital in Ethiopia.
Yeah, that was, I thought that was the weirdest thing until I found out that Ethiopia actually sent troops to help with the Korean War. And so South Korea and Ethiopia have had a relationship over the years, and Myeongsung Presbyterian Church in Seoul built this hospital in Addis Ababa, and also a medical school there with it, and they still have this relationship. There's still a few veterans of that conflict around Ethiopian, and they can be treated at any time for free at this hospital.
Oh, interesting. What kind of orthopedic issues have you dealt with in some of these far-off places?
When we were working with Cure, we mostly worked with crippled children, and the pediatric orthopedics is unlike anything in the United States. I mean, I would see 14, 15-year-old adolescents walking literally on the top of their foot because they had an untreated club foot from when they were born. Also in Honduras, we saw a fair number of kids with bone and joint injuries from stray gunshot wounds because there was so much violence in Honduras that the growth plate and bones or the joints would be damaged from stray gunfire or infections from untreated trauma. In Ethiopia, where we were in 2014, it was a general hospital, and there was a Cure hospital in the same city that took care of most of the pediatrics. So I kind of gravitated to the only thing Cure didn't want to take care of, and that was kids with chronic bone and joint infections.
Speaking of Honduras and violence, it's hard, I think, for most of us not to think about the current political conversations related to immigration from Central America. You got any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I do. I really feel sorry for those people. I don't think anybody in America can imagine being willing to put what you can carry on your back, including your infants and all, and strike out on a multi-thousand-mile hike to get away from a place. But those people constantly deal with their teenagers being pressured to join a gang or being killed in their high school or middle school, teenagers and other folks abducted, any judges that have tried to do anything down there. One judge was in her car in an intersection in the middle of a town, El Progreso, close to us. And two guys pull up on a motorcycle in the middle of the day and just sprayed her car with machine gun fire and killed her because she had been tough on the gangs and the drug groups and so forth. And the president is, in my mind, worthless. He was elected while we were there in 2013, I believe, and they are not supposed to be reelected under the Constitution, but he declared the Constitution unconstitutional and got reelected. So you can kind of figure out what a crazy place it is to live and work. I if I could take those people in, I'd take them in a heartbeat.
Let me use your pediatric orthopedics background as kind of a poor segue to this first song that you've identified, Cats in the Cradle. Why is that one special to you?
Cats in the Cradle is special because we came to Sanford thinking it was a small town and be a great place to raise kids, and it was, but being a small town, it was always difficult to find a partner in my orthopedic practice, so that I wound up working a lot of crazy hours, and we always worried that we weren't spending enough time doing the right things with our kids to raise them properly, and that's pretty much what the song is about, kids being raised without a parent, and then they never come home. And
you have a couple of kids yourself.
I do. I have a daughter that lives outside Denver, Colorado, and a son who's in investment banking in Oakland, California, and I really worried about him falling prey to the 100-hour weeks plus and so forth, and I was delighted recently when he told his boss he was quitting. And he didn't quit, but he impressed the boss with the fact that, we got to do something different here. And I got to have more time to spend with my daughter, who's now just over a year old. And so hopefully I didn't totally ruin his attitude towards work, family, balance. And
well, it sounds like he learned something of the value of that, having a right family-work balance, and that undoubtedly came from you in significant part.
I hope so, although we always feared we weren't spending enough time, and probably my biggest regret in the way I went about raising our kids was that I didn't spend a lot of time in church when they were growing up. My wife took them to Sunday school and took them here and took them there, and I generally had something that I thought was more important on Sunday mornings until about 11:25 when I would show up for what I called the meat of the service at church. And if I could change anything, that would be one thing I would change. That's a real cats in the cradle that I wish I had not been so busy, is to take my children to church instead of watching my wife take them while I did something else.
What's your wife's name?
Susan.
Well, it's a powerful song. Let's hear it. Cats in the Cradle by Harry Chapin.
A child arrived just the other day. He came to the world in the usual way, but there were planes to catch and bills to...
That was Cats in the Cradle by Harry Chapin. And if you're just joining us, our guest today is Dr. Ted Beemer. Ted, let me have us pick up, if we could, with your thoughts on, I'll call it transition. You spent a lot of years doing sort of traditional orthopedic surgery in more traditional settings, and then decided to get into it in kind of a different way. And then more recently, you've done some more transitioning. Talk to us about your own personal experience in those transitions.
Probably the biggest transition, we went to Dominican Republic thinking I would do some traditional orthopedic surgery and did not find any to do. And then when I wound up working for Cure International, they were doing all this orthopedic pediatric surgery, and I thought, well, I really don't know how to do that. And Scott Nelson was the surgeon there, and the medical director, he said, don't worry, you won't do anything here you would have learned in the States anyway. I need to teach you how to do the stuff here. So I said, okay. And so basically I got a pediatric orthopedic education for third world countries, which is different than here. And then Like I mentioned a while ago, when I wound up in Ethiopia, Cure had a hospital there, but I was at a different hospital. So I sort of had to find my own niche there, and I wound up treating a lot of chronic infections that, again, are quite different than in the United States, in that we didn't have the antibiotics to use that you have in the United States. We couldn't keep people in the hospital for weeks, and we didn't have home care to get big doses of antibiotics, so we had to treat them differently with antibiotics in time-released form. We mixed antibiotics in bone cement that's used for total joints and put those in the bone so that the antibiotics would leach out gradually, and we'd change them every once in a while to treat the infection locally, if you will. And we just had a lot of support in the States from companies that would donate the bone cement, some of the antibiotics, and also gave us a lot of money to take care of patients. That interesting hospital that we were at, the Korean hospital, they built the hospital, but they did not support it, which I thought was another oddity about a different culture. And so we were given a good bit of money by some of the companies I had dealt with in the States that we used to pay the hospital bills for patients over there. It was that was quite a transition. And then when we came back home in 2014 and decided to stay and help take care of my wife's aging parents, and I went to work part-time in a small town in South Carolina, and that was another transition, coming back to having all this nice, shiny equipment and everything in the world that you could want to work with, and people that were interested in helping, and that was great for a while. And then the biggest transition, and I mentioned a song, The Gambler. I used lines from that song a lot, but the most recent time was knowing when to walk away from orthopedics and knowing when to run. And I did not want to hang around long enough that I had to do that running thing. It was time to walk away. And looking back, it was probably time to walk away from the mission work as well, instead of waiting until you felt like you had to run away. I had some dark periods in there, particularly when I was on hormone treatment for prostate cancer. And one reason Cure decided to close the Honduran hospital was they frankly told me they were afraid the next phone call they got from me would be from the airport in Atlanta saying I wasn't going back. And they were
concerned about burnout.
They were concerned that I was really, really shot. And I think I probably did reach that point a lot, just dealing with attitudes, knowing that you could do so much more if you just had a little bit of cooperation and a little bit more organization and a little bit of help. And seems like the attitude you run into so many times overseas is, well, that's just not how we do things here. And I've said before, my wife is one of the lowest key people in the world, and when she starts to feel pretty frustrated and aggravated, you better get a straitjacket ready for me. And
your wife's background, you were telling me before we came in the studio, is also in the medical arena. What is her background?
She is a certified registered nurse anesthetist, and overseas the laws were all over the books. She worked a great deal trying to organize and get things better. For instance, in Ethiopia, they had a lot of tuberculosis and HIV, and we were also there when Ebola broke out in Western Africa. We were in Eastern Africa, but easily connected by flights. And the Ethiopians used the same mask and breathing tubes and so forth from one patient to the next without ever even cleaning them or wiping them off with as much as an alcohol pad. So my wife finally got them to clean this equipment between patients in boiled water and Clorox and hang them up to dry. And they did it for about a week, and then they said, that's too much trouble. And they went back to doing it the way they'd always done it.
And your wife being the laid-back one, that got even to her. And
that got to her. That was another thing where you decide it's time to walk away and just not get run off.
Well, you've given us a great introduction to the song. Let's hear it. The Gambler by Kenny Rogers.
On a warm summer's evening, on a train bound for nowhere, I met up with a gambler, we were both too tired. When you're sitting at the table, there'll be time enough for counting when the deal is done.
That was Kenny Rogers with The Gambler. Our guest today is Dr. Ted Beemer. Ted, let me have you sit back a little bit here and tell us something about what motivates you, why you've done the things you've done. I sort of have the sense that given your church connections and some of our conversation before we came into the studio, that there's a faith perspective here that says something about your motivation. Would you mind filling us in?
Yeah, I was raised in the church, and I've always gone to church. Well, mostly always gone to church. But at one point, I just felt that I was totally on the wrong road. And some of that was a patient I had when I was in practice, and a patient I didn't particularly care for personally, but she brought me a present, and I was happy to get a present until I opened it and saw that it was the first 3 or 4 volumes of the Left Behind series of books. And I thought, oh man, religious books, I really don't. I thought this was a good present. And they sat and looked at me for a while, the books. And I finally picked one up and opened it, and it's about this airline pilot bemoaning the fact that his wife has his son going to church, and they're boring, and there's this stewardess he's thinking about talking up for their stopover in Europe. And I thought, well, this might not be a bad book. And then the rapture happens, if you believe in the literal rapture. Some do, some don't. But he starts trying to figure out why his wife and son are gone, and he and his daughter are still there. And he winds up at the church they went to, and the associate minister is still there as well, looking at a video that the minister made. Is basically, if I turn up missing, this is where I've gone. And I can tell you exactly where I was, what I was doing when I read that, and I thought that associate minister probably thought that in case of rapture, I'll be gone, but he wasn't. And what hit me that night was that in case of rapture, I wasn't going anywhere either. And that was about the time that I decided I needed to do things differently and get more involved with church and mission work that we had talked about a time or two over the years. And about that time, I was in our service at St. Luke one Sunday morning. Another time I can remember where I was and where I was sitting and standing and what I was doing when I heard the song, "Here I Am, Lord." And it just hit me like a trickle of sweat down my back, like I've only, thank goodness, felt a few times in the operating room when you realize you're in big trouble. And you got to step back and rethink things and do something differently to get yourself out of trouble. And at that point in time, I just resolved to start saying yes. You want me to do something around here? Sure, I'll sweep floors. I'll do whatever. And we wound up going on some mission trips with youth and then to the Dominican Republic. And we wound up involved in a lot of things around Sanford, handyman ministry, and re-roofed some houses and did some things with the Appalachia Service Project and youth mission trips to eastern Tennessee. And I can go back to those couple of moments where, for whatever reason, it was sort of like getting hit by lightning. That you might think you're sailing along and doing fine here in your comfortable little world, but you're sadly mistaken. And that was the point in time that I turned around. My wife was already involved with a lot of stuff, teaching Sunday school, and she even went on that mission trip with the Grace Christian Group, and I thought I was too busy at home I'd stay home and do something really grand at home and surprise her by repainting the bedroom while she's gone. And, looking back, I was thinking, how stupid was that? Who cares what color the bedroom is when you could have been down there maybe doing something better for somebody else? So that's where that came from, and that song and that book and that particular lady that I didn't particularly care for personally. And it's amazing how God works sometimes if you just kind of sit down and friend of mine used to say when he came on something hard, he said, well, I just kind of need to go home and sit down in a cool, dark, quiet room with some soft music playing. And he used to have a cappuccino. If I had a cappuccino, I wouldn't be sitting quietly, but he'd say, I'll get a cappuccino and I'll have to think about this a while and then I'll do something about it. And that was basically what I did at that point in time.
Well, Ted, I think that's a good place to leave it. I want to say before we play that song, Here I Am, Lord, want to thank you for taking the time to be with us. I know you've made a special trip to join us, and we appreciate it. Your honesty and your sharing of your heart is something that we just feel privileged to witness, to listen to. So thank you for being our guest.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it, and I can't put it into this how much the music has meant to me, particularly over the years. We were overseas. We could still get it on the computer if we had internet, which was tough in Ethiopia and China sometimes. But
couldn't always hear us, but
couldn't always hear you. But when we could, we tuned it in. It has meant a lot to me over the years.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to have you as a listener. Let's hear the song, Here I Am, Lord. And we're going to hear the version by John Michael Talbot.
I, the Lord of sea and sky, I have heard